Namaskar. Welcome to the episode on conservation of ecology. Conservation involves preservation, management and proper use of biodiversity and other natural resources. This may yield the greatest sustainable benefit for the present and future generations. In this episode, let us try to understand to the very essential features of conservation of ecology. The main objective of learning has been presented under 5 broad categories. They are as follows. First, conservation, its definition and background. Second, conservation of biodiversity and natural resources. Third, conservation strategies. Fourth, global code of ethics for tourism. And fifth, tourism codes and conduct. Firstly, coming to the introduction. India in ancient and medieval times provided a system of moral guidelines towards environmental preservation and conservation. Environmental ethics, as proposed by ancient scriptures and seers, continued to exist in society. The same was not only practiced by common man, but even by rulers and kings. These principles were properly knitted with Indian way of life. But under the changing scenario, it is essential for everybody to know the importance of conservation of ecology. Defining conservation. Conservation depends on the continued health and productivity of local ecosystems. Thus, conservation embraces preservation, maintenance, sustainable utilization, restoration and enhancement of the natural environment. Let us understand conservation problems are generally problems of exploitation. It involves and careful planning, implementation and monitoring. As such, are also important the sustainable tourism strategies. Ecologically sound conservation practices conflict with the livelihoods of stakeholders. Ecology and conservation occupy advanced positions in the hierarchy of needs. The results of conservation practices are generally delayed, taking long periods of time to become apparent. The symptoms of environmental problems are subtle. Hence, the local communities and the government machinery would be reluctant to deal with an invisible problem. Currently, conservation initiatives in general and with particular reference to tourism do not regulate exploitation. Rather, unregulated development proceeds to the point of ecological collapse. Sadly, it is only in the aftermath of ecological collapse that conservation strategies are initiated. Conservation initiatives created in the aftermath of collapse are compromised by the fact that they are generated by the very institutional frameworks with development mentality, which promoted over-exploitation in the first place and which are therefore saturated with the edicts of development. Market failure encourages individuals, industries and governments to increase pollution and degrade natural resources. Vested interests mine the natural capital, exploit the local, regional, national and global commons and pollute without internalizing the cause of environmental degradation. Conservation ecology issues can be discussed under 2 broad headings: conservation of biodiversity, conservation of natural resources. Coming to conservation of biodiversity. Despite mounting efforts over the past 20 years, the loss of the world's biological diversity, mainly from habitat destruction, overharvesting, pollution and the inappropriate introduction of foreign plants and animals has continued. Biological resources constitute a capital asset with great potential for yielding sustainable benefits. Urgent action is needed to conserve and maintain genes, species and ecosystems with a view to the sustainable management and use of biological resources. Effective national action and international cooperation is required for this purpose. The participation and support of local communities are essential to the success of such an approach. Coming to conservation of natural resources. Conservation of natural resources is an essential component for any sustainable tourism strategy. A recently emerging approach is the Integrated Natural Resource Management (INRM). This is a process of incorporating the multiple aspects of natural resource use into a system of sustainable management to meet production goals of producers and direct users, for example, food security, profitability, risk aversion, as well as goals of the wider community, for example, poverty alleviation, welfare of future generations, environmental conservation. The biophysical factors would include vegetation distribution, abundance and diversity, resilience and pest pressure, slope, climate, nutrient cycling, energy flow, soil erosion rates and soil moisture storage. The socio-political factors would embrace structure of the governance system, social customs, land tenure, social amenities, demography, conflicts and gender. The economic factors would include prices and availability of inputs, availability and cost of labor, producer prices, degree of market integration, of farm income, availability or accessibility of credit and technologies, surplus or deficit over previous years. Conservation strategies. Conservation strategies enhance tourism experiences, promote the rehabilitation and restoration of damaged ecosystems and the recovery of endangered species. Also, it analyzes the potentials and constraints for augmentation, substitution and conservation of natural resources for long-term sustainable development. Improve awareness, training and interpretation or demonstration programs on best practice case studies and field visits by horizontal transfer of appropriate technologies for conservation. Actively involve the local communities and other stakeholders in evolving local, regional and national strategies for conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of biological resources for achieving livelihood or food or energy security with an analysis of relevant cost and benefits. Evolve community-based or run micro-enterprises using the local natural resources such as ecotourism so that they can generate benefits like economic, social or environmental for a community of stakeholders both in the short run and with a high probability in the long run. Integrate conservation and development, that is policies, legislation, implementation, participation, etc. based on gender balanced approach. Integrate the local strategies for the conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of biological resources into national development policies, strategies and action plans. Take appropriate measures for the fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from research and development and use of biological and genetic resources including biotechnology between the sources of those resources and those who use them. Recognize and foster the traditional methods and the knowledge of indigenous people and communities relevant to the conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of biological resources. Evolve appropriate packages of incentives, for example, subsidies, compensations, tax holidays, etc., and disincentives, for example, fines, taxes, etc., for encouraging all participants to adapt conservation strategies. Now, next coming to Global Code of Ethics for Tourism. A Global Code of Ethics for Tourism was evolved by the Commission on Sustainable Development (CSD) in New York in April 1999. The following are the 10 principles. Contribution to mutual understanding. The understanding and promotion of the ethical values common to humanity with an attitude of tolerance and respect for the diversity of religious, philosophical and moral beliefs are both the foundation and the consequence of responsible tourism. They must pay particular attention to the safety of foreign tourists, should facilitate the introduction of specific means of information, prevention, security, insurance and assistance consistent with their needs. Tourists and visitors should not commit any criminal act and abstain from any offensive or injurious act. They have the responsibility to acquaint themselves with the characteristics of the countries of visit. They must be aware of the health and security risks inherent in any travel outside their usual environment and behave in such a way as to minimize those risks. A vehicle for individual and collective fulfillment. Tourism, the activity most frequently associated with rest and relaxation, sport and access to culture, should be planned and practiced as a privileged means of individual and collective fulfillment. It is an irreplaceable factor of self-education, mutual tolerance, and for learning about the legitimate differences between people and cultures and their diversity. Tourism activities should respect the equality of men and women. They should promote human rights. The exploitation of human beings in any form, particularly sexual, especially when applied to children, conflicts with the fundamental aims of tourism and is the negation of tourism. Travel for purposes of religion, health, education and cultural or linguistic exchanges are particularly beneficial forms of tourism which deserve encouragement. The introduction into curricula of education about the value of tourist exchanges, their economic, social and cultural benefits and also their risks should be encouraged. A factor of sustainable development. All the stakeholders in tourism development should safeguard the natural environment. Tourism infrastructure should be designed and tourism activities programmed in such a way as to protect the natural heritage composed of ecosystems and biodiversity and to preserve endangered species of wildlife, the stakeholders in tourism development. Especially professionals should agree to the imposition of limitations or constraints on their activities when they are exercised in particularly sensitive areas. Desert, polar or high mountain regions, coastal areas, tropical forests or wetlands, propitious to the creation of nature reserves or protected areas. Nature tourism and ecotourism are recognized for enhancing the standing of tourism. Cultural heritage of mankind. Tourism policies and activities should be conducted with respect to the artistic, archaeological and cultural heritage. It should be protected and passed on to future generations. Encouragement should be given to public access to privately owned cultural property and monuments with respect for the rights of their owners as well as to religious buildings without prejudice to normal needs of worship. Financial resources derived from visits to cultural sites and monuments should be used for the upkeep, safeguard, development and embellishment of this heritage. Tourism activity should be planned in such a way as to allow traditional cultural products, crafts and folklore to survive and flourish rather than causing them to degenerate and become standardized. A beneficial activity for host countries and communities. Local populations should be associated with tourism activities and share equitably in the economic, social and cultural benefits they generate. Tourism professionals, particularly investors, should carry out studies of the impact of their development projects on the environment and natural surroundings. They should also deliver information on their future programs. Obligations of stakeholders in tourism development. Tourism professionals must provide tourists with objective and honest information on their places of destination, should contribute to the cultural and spiritual fulfillment of tourists and allow them during their travels to practice their religions. Governments have the right to inform their nationals of the difficult circumstances or even the dangers they may encounter during their travels abroad. The specialized travel press and the other media should issue honest and balanced information on events and situations that could influence the flow of tourists. Tourism codes, rights to tourism. The prospect of direct and personal access to the discovery and enjoyment of the planet's resources constitutes a right equally open to all of the world's inhabitants. The universal right to tourism must be regarded as a corollary of the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. Social tourism, and in particular associative tourism, which facilitates widespread access to leisure, travel and holidays, should be developed with the support of the public authorities. Family, youth, student and senior tourism and tourism for people with disabilities should be encouraged and facilitated. Liberty of tourist movements. Tourists and visitors should benefit from the liberty to move within their countries and from one state to another. Tourists and visitors should have access to all available forms of communication, internal or external. They should also benefit from prompt and easy access to local administrative, legal and health services. They should be free to contact the consular representatives of their countries of origin in compliance with the diplomatic conventions in force. Tourists and visitors should benefit from the same rights as the citizens of the country visited concerning the confidentiality of the personal data and information concerning them. Administrative procedures relating to border crossings such as visas or health and customs formalities should be adapted so far as possible. Agreements between groups of countries to harmonize and simplify these procedures should be encouraged. Specific taxes and levies penalizing the tourism industry should be gradually corrected. Travelers should have access to allowances of convertible currencies needed for their travels. Rights of the workers and entrepreneurs in the tourism industry. The fundamental rights of salaried and self-employed workers in the tourism industry and related activities should be guaranteed under the supervision of the national and local administrations. They should have the right and duty to acquire appropriate initial and continuous training, be given adequate social protection, and job insecurity should be limited. A specific status should be offered to seasonal workers of this section. Any natural or legal person having the necessary abilities and skills should be entitled to develop a professional activity in the field of tourism under existing national laws. Entrepreneurs and investors should be entitled to free access to the tourism sector with a minimum of legal or administrative restrictions. Exchanges of experience offered to executives and workers contributes to foster the development of the world tourism industry, such that these movements should be facilitated in compliance with the applicable national laws and international conventions. As an irreplaceable factor of solidarity in dynamic growth of international exchanges, multinational enterprises of the tourism industry should not exploit the dominant positions or their induced imports, a reduction of their contribution to the economics in which they are established. Partnership and the establishment of balanced relations between enterprises of generating and receiving countries contribute to the sustainable development of tourism and an equitable distribution of the benefits of its growth. Next, coming to implementation of the Global Code. The public and private stakeholders in tourism development should cooperate in the implementation of these principles and monitor their effective application. The stakeholders in tourism development should recognize the role of international institutions and non-governmental organizations with competence in the field of tourism promotion and development. The protection of human rights, the environment or health with due respect for the general principles of international law. The same stakeholders should demonstrate their intention to refer any disputes concerning the application or interpretation of the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism for conciliation to an impartial third body known as the World Committee on Tourism Ethics. Calls upon the entire stakeholders in tourism development at national, regional and local levels to model their conduct on the principles embodied in this Global Code of Ethics for Tourism and to implement them in good faith. Let me now conclude that as of now, we have already entered into the realm of disaster. By our thoughtless acts, the globe is turning into a large garbage heap. We have ruthlessly robbed nature and desertified Earth. But the worst crime we continue to commit is to deprive the planet of its deep, fresh cover of dense forest. It was truly a global issue. Now it is time to rise and act. Conservation of ecology is the need of the hour. It is a desiderata for the present survival and future sustenance. If it is not now, never it will be then. Thank you.